The snow had been falling since noon. By the time Nora Calloway pushed open the door of the diner on South Halsted Street, it lay 3 inches thick on the sidewalk and showed no sign of stopping. The kind of snow that muffled everything: footsteps, traffic, the distant sound of church bells marking 8 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The kind of snow that made the world feel smaller, quieter, more forgiving than it actually was. Nora was not fooled by it. She guided her daughters through the door with a hand on each of their small shoulders, Callie on the left, Wren on the right as always, and let the warmth of the diner wash over them. The smell hit first: coffee that had been sitting too long, bacon grease from a grill that never fully cooled, a faint trace of pine from the plastic Christmas tree wedged into the corner near the register. Underneath it all, the specific smell of a place that had fed working people for 30 years without ever once pretending to be something it wasn't. Nora scanned the room. Old habit, new instinct, left side first, then right, then the back, then the door behind her. 4 other tables occupied. An elderly couple near the window, their heads bent close together over matching coffee cups. A trucker at the counter, broad-shouldered, eating scrambled eggs without looking up from his phone. 2 women in their 30s sharing a piece of pea in a conversation that involved a lot of hand gestures. A teenage boy in a booth near the back, earbuds and textbook open in front of him, but eyes on the ceiling. No one she recognized, no one watching her. She exhaled once quietly and steered the girls toward the corner booth, the one with sight lines to both the front door and the side exit, with her back against the wall. Thomas had always teased her about needing to sit with her back to the wall in restaurants. He'd called it her cowboy habit. She'd called it common sense. Thomas had laughed and let her have it every time, because Thomas was the kind of man who let you have the small things without making you explain why they mattered. Thomas had been dead for 6 months. Nora unzipped Callie's coat first, then Wren's, hanging them both on the hook at the end of the booth. She left her own coat on. Beneath it, her sweater was worn thin at the elbows, soft in the wrong places, and bore a stain near the collar that hadn't come out despite 2 washings in the motel bathroom sink. She couldn't let anyone see. She had enough to deal with without adding the particular humiliation of being visibly poor in public. Though she suspected everyone could tell anyway. Callie pressed herself against Nora's left side immediately, her small body radiating the particular warmth of a child who had been cold for too long and was now desperately absorbing heat from everything within reach. Wren sat on her right, more contained, more watchful, studying the laminated menu with an expression of focused concentration that was almost comically serious for a 5-year-old. Both girls had their father's blonde hair, which hung limp and uncombed tonight, because Nora had lost the good hairbrush somewhere in the last motel and hadn't had the presence of mind to buy a new one. She looked at the menu, though she already knew what she was going to order. She had been doing the math for the last hour, sitting in the parking lot of this diner with the engine off and the heat fading because she couldn't afford to keep burning gas just to stay warm. $15 in cash. That was what she had left. Not in an account. She had closed the account 2 months ago when Warren Pulse's men started asking questions at her bank. $15 folded in her jacket pocket, which she had reached in to confirm so many times in the past hour that the paper had gone soft along the creases. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, 2 small milks. That was $11.50 before tax if she'd read the menu board correctly from the window before coming in. Leave a $1 tip, walk out with maybe $2 in change. She would not order anything for herself. This was not a decision she agonized over anymore. She had stopped agonizing over it somewhere around day 3 of not eating properly, when hunger had settled from a sharp complaint into a dull and manageable ache that she could fold down and tuck away like the stained sweater under her coat. The girls needed to eat. They were 5 years old and they had been existing on gas station crackers and peanut butter for 2 days. They would eat tonight. Nora would be fine. She had been telling herself she would be fine for 6 months. The waitress appeared, a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of eyes that had seen every variety of human trouble without losing either their sharpness or their basic decency. She pulled a notepad from her apron pocket with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. "What can I get you, hun?" Nora's throat tightened. It did this, sometimes closed up without warning, as if her body had decided to grieve at the most inconvenient possible moments. She pressed through it. "2 grilled cheese sandwiches, please, and 2 small milks." The waitress wrote it down. "Anything for you?" "No, just them." A pause, brief but perceptible. The waitress's eyes moved from Nora's face, pale-shadowed beneath the eyes, too thin across the cheekbones, to the twins pressed against their mother's eyes like small, warm animals seeking heat. Then she nodded without comment and walked away. Nora set the menu down carefully. She noticed her hands were trembling and made herself lay them flat on the table until they stopped. "Mama," Callie's voice soft and careful, a voice she used when she was trying not to upset anyone. "Are we going home tonight?" The word hit Nora somewhere behind the sternum. Home. They had a home once. A 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Lane in Oak Park with white trim and a front porch that needed repainting and a backyard with a maple tree that Thomas had hung a rope swing from the summer before last. Nora had complained about the swing being crooked. Thomas had said it had character. They had argued about it for approximately 4 minutes and then laughed about it for the rest of the evening, the way you laugh when life is ordinary and safe, and you don't yet understand how fragile ordinary and safe actually are. The house was gone, the swing was gone. Thomas's tools were gone, his truck, his winter clothes, the girls' bunk beds, the dining table they'd bought together at an estate sale in Evanston and carried up the front steps with a lot of swearing and laughing. All of it gone, taken piece by piece by men who showed up in trucks and treated each object in her life as a line item on a spreadsheet. "We're staying somewhere warm tonight," Nora said. She brushed a strand of hair from Callie's forehead. "I promise." Wren, still studying the room with those serious eyes, said quietly, "The place with the scratchy blankets." "No, somewhere better." She didn't know if that was true. She had $15 and no plan beyond feeding her daughter's dinner. The motel they'd been in last week, one with the scratchy blankets and the heater that made a sound like something dying inside the walls, had been found. Dale Lynch had knocked on the door at 2 in the morning 3 days ago. Not loudly, not aggressively, just a firm and patient knock that said, "We know exactly where you are, and we are in no hurry because there is nowhere you can go that we won't find you." She had packed everything in 9 minutes. She knew because she had counted the way she counted everything now, the way her mind had become a constant running ledger of time and money and risk. They had been sleeping in the car since. 2 nights in a parking garage on West Adams, 1 night outside a 24-hour Walgreens, where the security guard had given her a long look but hadn't said anything. Tonight she had driven here because the girls were hungry and because she could not watch Wren try to sleep sitting up in a car seat one more time without breaking in a way she was not sure she could come back from. Across the room, the trucker at the counter glanced at them briefly and went back to his phone. The elderly couple murmured to each other. Outside, the snow kept falling. Nora's hand drifted to her jacket pocket. She pressed the folded bill between her fingers, the way other people might touch a rosary, not out of religious conviction, but out of the sheer animal need to hold on to something real. And then she made herself stop, made herself take her hand out of her pocket because she had been doing it too much tonight, and she needed to save the small gestures of comfort for when she truly couldn't manage without them. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the night she found the letter. It was 14 days after the funeral. She had been trying to clean out the garage. Not because she wanted to, she didn't want to do anything, had barely been able to get out of bed, had been operating on the kind of automated grief function that allowed her to feed the girls breakfast and answer their questions and hold them when they cried without her self-dissolving entirely, but because she needed to file the insurance paperwork, and the insurance company wanted documentation of assets. The toolbox was in the corner of the garage, the big red Craftsman one that Thomas had owned since before they met, that he had carried from apartment to apartment for 10 years before they finally had a place with a garage to put it in. She had opened it, intending to make a list. The envelope was taped to the inside of the lid. Her name in Thomas's handwriting, that particular combination of careful printing and lazy cursive that she would have known anywhere on anything for the rest of her life. She had sat down on the concrete floor of the garage and opened it right there with the November cold coming through the gaps in the walls and the sound of the girls watching television inside the house drifting faintly through the door. He had written 3 pages. Nora, if you're reading this, then the thing I've been afraid of finally happened. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for leaving this way, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to tell you. He had seen the cardiologist 8 months before he died. An irregular heartbeat, the doctor had said. Could be nothing. Could be the beginning of something serious. Needed monitoring, needed medication, needed possibly a procedure. Thomas had started the medication for 3 weeks and then stopped because the cost, even with insurance, had cut into the margin he needed to make the loan payment. The loan. He had borrowed $8,000 from a man named Warren Pulse 18 months before he died. Not through a bank, not through any official channel, through a connection he had made doing electrical work for a bar on Milwaukee Avenue, a man who lent money to working people who couldn't get it any other way, at rates that were steep, but not, Thomas had told himself, unreasonable for the risk. He had used the money for a van equipment, a business license, the foundation of the company he had been building in the hours between his regular jobs. He had been so close. That was the thing Thomas kept writing across those 3 pages in his crooked handwriting, so close to not needing to borrow from anyone anymore, so close to having something real to give them. He had been paying the interest faithfully. He had been making it work. He had never told Nora because he hadn't wanted her to worry. He had not told her about the heart condition either for the same reason. He thought he had more time. He wrote that twice. I thought I had more time. Nora had read the letter sitting on the cold garage floor, and when she finished, she sat there for a long time without moving. Not crying, past crying. In the particular stillness of someone who has just understood something enormous and irreversible and has not yet decided how to carry it. She did not hate Thomas. She could not. She understood him. She understood the particular logic of a man who loved his family so much that he absorbed every fear alone, who would rather run himself to nothing than let anyone he loved see him struggling, who kept saying, I've got it, right up until the moment he didn't. She understood that logic. She had inherited it. What she could not make fit into any frame that made sense was what happened next. Warren Pulse came 16 days after the funeral. He came with Dale Lynch and a third man, whose name Nora never learned, a thick-necked man who stood slightly behind the other 2 and said nothing the entire time. They came in the early afternoon when the girls were napping, which Nora later wondered if they had known. Warren was not physically imposing. He was average height, average build, somewhere in his mid-40s, with thinning sandy hair, and the kind of unremarkable face that disappeared from memory almost immediately after you stopped looking at it. He wore a gray parka and clean boots and spoke in the measured, reasonable tones of a man conducting routine business. He was sorry for her loss, he said. Thomas had been a man who met his obligations mostly, and that was appreciated. But the loan had a balance. The interest had accumulated during the period of, he paused, delicately, disruption. The total outstanding amount was $43,000. Nora looked at him. She said very quietly that Thomas had borrowed $8,000. Warren agreed that was the original principal. He explained, still in that reasonable tone, about the compounding structure of the agreement, about the fees associated with missed payments during Thomas's final illness, about the cost of, he chose his words carefully, pursuing resolution. $43,000. He would give her 1 week. After he left, Nora stood in her own living room for a long time. The girls were still asleep upstairs. Outside, a neighbor was raking leaves. Everything was exactly as it had been an hour before, and nothing was the same at all. She spent the next 3 days trying to find someone to help her. A legal aid clinic gave her an hour with a young attorney named Preston, who looked barely old enough to drive and listened to her with an expression of increasing concern. He told her what she had already begun to suspect, that Warren Pulse's loan agreement, whatever Thomas had signed, was almost certainly structured to be impossible to pay off through normal means. The fees and interest clauses were the kind that existed not to be paid but to justify taking other things. He told her something else. He had looked up the property records, the house on Sycamore Lane. There was a lien on it filed 6 months earlier, around the same time Thomas had taken out the loan, signed apparently by Thomas. Nora told the young attorney that Thomas would never have signed the house over. The attorney looked at her carefully. He said that the signature on file did not look quite right to him either. He said he would need a handwriting expert to be certain, and without resources, without a real attorney, without time, what he suspected and what could be proven in court were two very different things. Nora drove home and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. Then she went inside and made dinner for her daughters. Warren came back the following week with a truck. 3 men came inside. They were efficient and impersonal, moving through her house with the methodical detachment of people performing a job. They took the sofa first, then the television, then the dining table with the chairs still tucked under it, Thomas's toolbox, the power tools from the garage, the drill press he had been so proud of, the table saw still in its original case, Callie's stuffed animals from the shelf in the living room, which one of the men swept into a bag without hesitation. Wren had been holding her favorite toy, a small cloth rabbit with a missing eye that she had owned since she was 18 months old. Dale Lynch had reached for it, and Nora had stepped in front of him. She had not raised her voice. She had said simply and clearly that they were not taking that. Something in her face must have communicated that she meant it with an absoluteness that was not open to negotiation, because Dale had looked at her for a moment, then shrugged and moved on. They left with the bunk beds last. Callie and Wren stood in the doorway of their bedroom and watched the men take apart the white-painted frames with the stars stenciled on the headboards. Stars Thomas had painted himself one October weekend with craft paint and a foam brush and a level of concentration he usually reserved for electrical diagrams. Wren did not make a sound. Callie took her sister's hand. That night, the girls slept on blankets on the floor, and Nora sat against the wall and watched them and allowed herself exactly 20 minutes to fall completely apart. Silently, with her knees pulled to her chest and her face buried in her arms, she let the grief and the rage and the terror move through her in waves. When the 20 minutes were up, she wiped her face, went to stand at the window, and made herself think practically. Practical was the only thing she had left. Warren came a third time in November, 6 weeks later. He brought paperwork. The house, he explained, had been secured as collateral against the loan. Thomas had agreed to these terms. The outstanding balance had not been addressed, and he was regrettably exercising the terms of the agreement. She had 48 hours to vacate. Nora looked at the papers. She looked at Thomas's signature at the bottom. She knew that handwriting like she knew her own heartbeat. That was not Thomas's signature. She said so. Warren looked at her with the patient expression of a man who had heard this before, who knew that what was provably true and what she could do about it in 48 hours with no money and no lawyer were entirely different equations. He said he was sorry. He said she could challenge it in court if she felt that was appropriate. He said he hoped she would take care of herself and her daughters. He left. Nora packed everything that fit into 3 bags in the trunk of her car, took her daughters by the hand, and walked out of the house on Sycamore Lane on a gray November afternoon without looking back. She was not going to let Callie and Wren see her look back. That had been 3 weeks ago. They had gone to a motel first, the one with the rattling heater paid for, with the last of the emergency cash she had kept hidden in a box beneath the bathroom sink, because that was the one place she had gambled Warren's men would not look. She had tried to be careful. She had changed motels twice, paid cash, used a false name she had practiced until it came easily. She had been found anyway. Dale Lynch had knocked at 2 in the morning, and the knock had said everything it needed to say without a single word being exchanged. She had packed in 9 minutes and driven away into the dark, and she had not stopped since, and now it was Christmas Eve, and her daughters were hungry, and she was sitting in a corner booth with $15 and nowhere left to run. The food arrived. 2 golden grilled cheese sandwiches cut diagonally, the cheese still pulling in slow strings. 2 small glasses of milk straws already in. The waitress set them down with a care that was slightly more deliberate than efficient, the way you set food down for people you have decided deserve particular gentleness. Callie's face changed completely. 5 years old, thin and watchful, and too accustomed to being careful, but in that moment just a child who had been hungry and was now looking at a grilled cheese sandwich, and the joy on her face was so uncomplicated and so complete that Nora's throat closed again. "Go ahead, babies," she managed. They ate with both hands, cheese pulling away in strings, milk disappearing in long draws through the straws. Nora watched them and said nothing and held the edge of the table with both hands beneath the surface where no one could see. Ren looked up mid-bite, perfectly serious. "Are you having some, Mama?" "I'm not hungry." Ren looked at her with an expression that suggested she did not find this entirely credible, but was willing to let it pass for now. She went back to her sandwich. Nora looked at the door. This was the thing she could not stop doing. Every 90 seconds roughly, her eyes went to the door. Not because she expected Warren or Dale to walk through it, not specifically, but because her nervous system had been running at high alert for 3 weeks and no longer knew how to stop. Her body had decided that every door was a potential threat until proven otherwise, and no amount of conscious reassurance could override that judgment. The door admitted an elderly man in a plaid coat helping his wife with her scarf. They shuffled past the hostess stand, smiling at each other. Not a threat. Nora looked away. She reached for the check the waitress had left face down at the edge of the table. She needed to know the number. She needed to confirm her math, and then she needed to leave enough for the tip, and then she needed to figure out where to take the girls tonight, how to make $15 stretch across one more night somewhere warm. Her fingers touched the edge of the check. "Don't." The word came from directly beside her, not from across the room, not from the door, from right beside the booth, and Nora's entire body went rigid before her conscious mind had registered what she had heard. She was already moving, already angling herself in front of the girls, already pulling them closer, and then she looked up. The man standing beside her booth was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a black suit that cost more than she had made in any single month of her adult life. Dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, slicked back from a face built of hard angles and controlled expression. His hands were in his pockets. He was not reaching for anything. He was not moving toward her. But she felt his presence the way you feel the edge of a drop in the dark, with something older and more reliable than vision. The tattoo started at his collar. Dark ink, intricate and deliberate, the kind that told a story she didn't know how to read but recognized as significant. His eyes were very dark and very still, and they were looking at her hand, the one extended toward the check, with an expression that contained underneath its absolute stillness a precise and burning attention. She had not heard him approach. He said nothing further. He simply waited. Nora became aware gradually that the diner had gone quiet. Not the quiet of a room where conversation has lapsed naturally. The particular quiet of a room where every person present has simultaneously decided to be very still and very unobtrusive. The trucker at the counter had stopped moving fork, suspended halfway to his mouth. The 2 women with the pie had stopped talking mid-sentence. The elderly couple who had just come in were standing near the hostess stand without moving toward a table. And she understood then what she was looking at. She had grown up in Chicago. She knew the city's various textures of danger. She knew the difference between men who were dangerous because they were desperate and men who were dangerous because they had built entire worlds on the assumption that they could be. The man standing beside her booth was the second kind, clearly and completely, and the 4 men currently stationed at unobtrusive points around the diner, she was only now noticing them near the counter, near the side exit, near the back hallway, were with him. Callie pressed into her side. Ren had stopped chewing entirely. The man looked at them, at Callie and Ren, their thin sweaters, their wide eyes, the half-eaten sandwiches in their small hands. Something moved across his face, quick and involuntary, there and gone. Then he looked back at Nora. "I'm not here for you," he said quietly. His voice was low, unhurried, with the particular quality of a man who had never needed volume to be heard. "I didn't come to this diner looking for you, Shiyu. I don't know you. I have no business with you." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did not ask permission. He did it with the natural authority of someone for whom the question of permission had long since become academic. Up close, she could see the scar through his left eyebrow, a silver ring on his right hand, plain and heavy, the lines around his eyes that belonged to a man in his early 50s who had not spent those years in a gentle environment. "Your husband," he said. "Where is he?" Nora's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He waited. He was extraordinarily patient. There was no impatience in him, no social discomfort with silence, no reflexive filling of empty space. He simply waited with the stillness of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use it correctly. "He's gone," she said finally. The words came out flattened, like something she had said so many times they had worn smooth. "He died 6 months ago." The man across from her was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved almost imperceptibly. "How old are they?" He glanced toward the girls. 5. "They just turned 5. He looked at Callie and Ren, for a moment really looked, the way you look at something that requires you to hold it carefully in your attention. 2 small girls in 2 thin sweaters with their father's blonde hair eating sandwiches their mother had ordered, but not shared. He looked at the empty space in front of Nora, where there was no food. He looked at her hands still trembling against the table. Then he looked back at her face. "Tell me what happened after he died," he said. It was not a request. She recognized that immediately. But it was also not the cold command of a man exercising power for its own sake. It was something in between, an instruction delivered with the authority of someone who intended to do something useful with the information and was therefore asking not for his convenience, but for hers. Nora looked at him. She should not tell him anything. Every functional instinct she possessed, every lesson the last 6 months had taught her about the cost of trusting strangers, said, "Do not speak. Say nothing. Take your daughters and go." But there was nowhere to go. The girls were warm for the first time in 3 days. And she was so tired, not the tired, that a night's sleep fixes, but the deep structural exhaustion of a person who has been holding everything up alone for too long, whose arms have begun to shake with it, who can no longer remember what it felt like not to be braced against the next blow. She told him. She told him about Thomas's letter, about the toolbox, about the $8,000, and the dream of the company, and the heart condition Thomas had carried alone until it killed him. She told him about Warren Pulse and the $43,000, the number that bore no relationship to anything real that had been manufactured from interest and fees and compounded penalties, that was designed not to be paid but to provide justification for taking everything else. She told him about the truck that came for the furniture and about the bunk beds with the painted stars and about Ren holding the rabbit and Dale Lynch reaching for it. She told him about the forged signature, about what the young attorney had said and what it meant that Thomas had never signed the house over, that the document was fabricated, that she had been living for 3 weeks as a woman who knew she had been robbed but had no way to prove it and no resources to fight it. She told him about Dale at the motel door at 2 in the morning. She told him about the car, about the parking garage in the Walgreens and the crackers and peanut butter, and Ren trying to sleep sitting up. She had not told anyone all of this at once. There had been no one to tell. The telling of it was strange, like releasing pressure from something that had been sealed too long. And alongside the relief, there was something like humiliation. And alongside the humiliation, there was something she had not expected. A clean, focused anger moving through her like a current that had been dammed and was now finally finding its channel. When she finished, the man across from her was very still. Their names, he said. She looked at him. Warren Pulse, she said, and Dale Inch. The names landed in the space between them. She watched his face. He did not react visibly. His expression did not change. His posture did not shift. But something happened in his eyes, something behind the stillness, something cold and precise that clicked into place the way a mechanism clicks when a key finds the right configuration. Across the diner, the man she would later learn was named Gideon exchanged a brief look with another of the suited men, barely perceptible. But she caught it, and whatever it communicated a great deal. They knew those names. These men told you the debt was legitimate, the man across from her said carefully, that their collection was authorized. They implied it. They said they had the right, that it was sanctioned. Did they use a specific name, say, who sanctioned it? Nora thought back. Warren's patient voice, his reasonable tone, the way he had spoken as if invoking an authority so established that naming it was unnecessary. They didn't say a name directly, but they spoke as if there was someone behind them, someone who made the sanction real. The man across from her nodded once, slowly. He reached into his jacket. She flinched. She couldn't help it. The instinct was faster than reason, but he withdrew only a wallet. He opened it and placed $300 on the table. Then he reached over and picked up the check the waitress had left, glanced at the total $14.76, and set down a $50 bill beside the check. Then he reached for the $15 bill that Nora had placed near the check when she reached for it. He picked it up. He looked at it for a moment, a single beat, something registering briefly in his expression that she could not read, and then he placed it directly in front of her. "Keep it," he said. Nora stared at the $300. At the 15 returned, she looked up at him and felt the question rising without her permission. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her for a moment across the small table, and for the first time she saw something beneath the controlled surface. Something that was not pity, did not have pity's condescension, but had its own quality of recognition. As if he had seen something in her face that he knew the shape of from a very long time ago. "Because I know what it looks like," he said quietly, "when a woman is carrying something she was never supposed to carry alone. And I know the men who put it on her." He stood buttoning his jacket with measured movements. "The Riverside Inn, 3 blocks north. Room 212 has been arranged. 1 week paid for. No conditions. I can't. You can." He looked at the girls at Callie with cheese still on her fingers, at Wren watching him with those grave and entirely unfrightened eyes. "And you will, for them." He turned toward the door. His men shifted ready and fell into formation. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. "Mrs. Calloway." The fact that he knew her name, she had not given it, registered like cold water moving through her. "Warren Pulse and Dale Inch will not come for you again." "How can you know that?" Her voice was barely a whisper. A pause, brief and absolute. "Because men like that," he said, "only operate as long as someone allows it." Then he pushed through the door and walked out into the snow, and the diner remained silent for 3 full seconds after he left. Then slowly, like a room filling with air, after a vacuum, everything resumed. The trucker's fork clinked against his plate. The 2 women looked at each other. The elderly couple moved toward a table. The waitress appeared at Nora's elbow. She looked at the money on the table at Nora's face at the door. "Honey," she said carefully, "do you know who that is?" Nora looked at the $300, at the $15 returned to her, at the window where she could see him through the frosted glass standing beside a black car in the falling snow, a phone pressed to his ear. His face turned slightly away. "No," Nora said. The waitress set down a slice of apple pie. Just that, no explanation, no comment. She set a fork beside it, looked at Nora once with those eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything, and walked away. Nora looked at the pie. She picked up the fork. Outside in the snow, the man stood with his phone to his ear, his voice entirely calm. The kind of calm that has nothing to do with the absence of feeling and everything to do with its absolute and surgical control. "I need everything you have on Warren Pulse and Dale Lynch," he said. "Every debt they've collected, every family they've touched, every dollar they have moved, every name they have used to do it." A pause. "All of it, by morning." He ended the call and stood in the snow and looked at nothing for a moment. Then he looked back through the frosted window of the diner at the woman eating a piece of apple pie, while her daughters leaned against her sides, warm and fed, and finally temporarily still. He looked at that for a long moment. Then he turned his face toward the city and started making more calls. His name was Declan Morrow, and before the night was over, Warren Pulse and Dale Lynch would understand what it meant that they had used it. The snow was still falling when Gideon stepped out of the shadows on South Halsted Street. Nora had been walking for less than half a block. Callie on her left, Wren on her right, both girls wrapped back into their thin coats, both carrying the paper bag the waitress had pressed into Nora's hands at the door. "Leftover pie carefully wrapped for tomorrow morning," the woman had said, in a tone that did not invite argument. Nora had the $300 folded into her jacket pocket alongside the 15. She could feel both the new money and the old, and the sensation was so disorienting that she kept her hand pressed flat against her pocket just to confirm it was real. The street was quiet. Christmas Eve had emptied South Halsted of most of its usual traffic. The bars further north were lit and audible thin music bleeding out into the cold. But here the storefronts were dark, their windows reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights through the fallen snow. Nora walked steadily, 3 blocks north, Riverside Inn, room 212. She was trying not to think about what any of it meant. Then Gideon stepped into the light. He came from her left, from the space between a parked SUV and a shuttered dry cleaner, and Nora pulled both girls behind her before she had consciously decided to move. Her body was faster than her mind now. It had been faster than her mind for weeks. He stopped immediately. Both hands came up open, visible. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice was low and even. "My name is Gideon. I work for Mr. Morrow. He asked me to make sure you reach the inn safely." Nora's heart was still hammering. Callie had grabbed the back of her coat with both fists. Wren had not made a sound, which somehow made it worse. "How long have you been behind us?" Nora said. "Since you left the diner." "That's not reassuring." "I know." He didn't apologize for it. "But you've been followed since this afternoon, not by us, by one of Pulse's people, gray sedans circling the block since around 4 o'clock. Mr. Morrow wanted to make sure they didn't get close to you tonight." Nora looked past him at the street. A gray sedan, she hadn't noticed it. She had believed she was being so careful, so observant, and she hadn't noticed a gray sedan circling for 4 hours. And the realization landed with the specific cold weight of understanding how thin the margins actually were. "He's gone now," Gideon said. "The sedan left when we came out of the diner." He paused. "Pulse knows he's losing his leverage with you. That makes his people unpredictable. Mr. Morrow doesn't want you on the street alone tonight." Nora looked at this man, measured professional, his hand still visible, his posture calibrated to communicate the minimum possible threat, and made the calculation her life had reduced itself to. Trust or don't trust. Move or stay still. Every choice against the consequences of guessing wrong, no longer abstract. "The inn is 2 more blocks," she said. "I know, I'll stay back. You won't see me." That's also not reassuring. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I'll stay where you can see me then." They walked the 2 remaining blocks that way, Nora and the girls ahead, Gideon 10 feet behind, visible under every streetlight. Callie kept looking back at him with the frank curiosity of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise her assessment of people. Wren kept her eyes forward, her small hand tight in Nora's, her jaw set with a determination that looked startlingly like Thomas when he had decided something. The Riverside Inn was a 2-story building set back slightly from the street, its neon sign throwing red light across the snow. Not a good hotel, not a bad one, the kind that existed between those categories that asked no unnecessary questions, changed the sheets, kept the locks working, and let its guests be whatever they needed to be without commentary. The woman at the front desk was already reaching for a key card when Nora came through the door. Callaway? Yes. Room 212, second floor end of the hall. She slid the card across. Checkouts at 11, but Mr. Morrow said a week, so you're through the 31st. Continental breakfast starts at 7. Nora took the key card. In the elevator, Callie leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Wren looked at the key card in Nora's hand. "Are we safe here, Mama?" she asked. Nora looked at her younger daughter, younger by 4 minutes. Thomas had always said, but older by about 4 years in terms of general demeanor, and thought about what to say. "Yes," she said, "tonight we are." Wren considered this. "What about tomorrow?" "Tomorrow too," Nora said. "I think." Wren nodded, apparently satisfied. She reached out and took Nora's free hand, and they rode the rest of the way up in silence. Room 212 was small and clean. 2 double beds with white comforters, a bathroom with functioning hot water. Nora turned the tap to confirm this within 30 seconds of entering. A heater that worked without rattling. A television. A small table by the window with 2 chairs. The window looked out over the back parking lot, empty except for a black sedan idling at the far edge with its lights off. Nora watched the sedan for a moment. It did not move. It was simply there the way a locked door is simply there, not a threat, but a fact, a statement of presence. She let the curtain fall. Behind her, the girls had already found the beds. Callie had crawled onto the nearest one, fully dressed, shoes still on, and was unconscious within approximately 90 seconds. Wren sat on the edge of the second bed and watched Nora while Nora unlaced her shoes and folded back the comforter. "Lie down, baby. Are you going to sleep?" "In a little while." "You should sleep." Wren lay back against the pillow. "You look tired, Mama." "I know. You always look tired." "I know that too." Wren reached up and touched Nora's face with one small hand, a gesture so gentle and so adult that Nora had to look away for a moment. Then Wren pulled her hand back and closed her eyes, and within minutes her breathing had slowed into sleep. Nora sat on the edge of the other bed beside Callie's sleeping form and stayed very still. The room was warm, the beds were soft. Her daughters were asleep and fed and safe, and no one was going to knock on this door at 2 in the morning because the black sedan in the parking lot would ensure that, and Nora understood this the way you understand the logic of something that contains both danger and protection, that these two things were sometimes made of identical materials and distinguished only by direction. She reached into her jacket pocket, the $300. She unfolded the bills and laid them on the bed beside her. Real money, more than she had held at once since before Thomas died. And beneath it in her other pocket, the 15. She pulled it out, looked at it. The $15 bill was worn soft at the folds. She knew this bill. She had known it for 6 months. She knew the particular way the corner was bent, the small smudge near Andrew Jackson's jaw, the series of numbers she had memorized without intending to, because her hands had found it so many times in the dark of various motels, in the front seat of her car, in the aisles of gas stations, where she stood with the coin purse open trying to make things work. Thomas had withdrawn $20 from the ATM at the Walgreens on Harrison Street on the afternoon of June 14th. She knew this because she had requested the bank statement in the weeks after he died, trying to understand the shape of his last days, trying to hold whatever pieces of him she could still find. $20. He had bought a coffee, $1.47 at the place near the job site where he had been working that week. He had bought a pack of gum, $1.35. He had come home with $17.18 in his wallet. He had died in his sleep that night. The paramedics had given her his wallet the next morning, along with his phone and his wedding ring and the small notebook he always kept in his breast pocket for writing down measurements. She had taken $17 from the wallet for an incidental expense she no longer remembered because life had continued in its brutal and administrative way. She had kept the $15 bill, Not consciously, not deliberately, she had simply never spent it, and at some point she had understood that she was not going to. That she was keeping it the way you keep certain objects, not because they are valuable, but because they are the last physical trace of a specific moment, a specific person, a specific version of everything before. She had carried it for 6 months. Through Warren's visits, and the loss of the house and the motel rooms, and the nights in the car. She had had it in her pocket tonight when she was counting $15 and trying to make the math work for dinner. And she had not known, not until Declan Morrow picked it up and held it for a moment before placing it back in front of her, that it was this bill, the last one, the one she had kept. He had not known what it was, but he had given it back anyway. Nora folded the bill carefully along its original creases and walked to where she had set her bag on the table. She unzipped the small interior pocket where she kept her wedding ring. She had stopped wearing it when she understood that men who took a woman's dining table would take a wedding ring without a second thought, and she placed the folded $15 bill beside it. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, put her face in her hands, and allowed herself 4 minutes. Not more than 4. She had learned to ration this. When it was over, she wiped her face, straightened her back, and began to think practically about tomorrow. Because tomorrow was coming regardless, and her daughters would wake up in it, and they would need her to be ready. Outside in the parking lot below the sedan, sat in the snow, and the city kept turning. And somewhere across it, a man named Declan Morrow was on a phone making the calls that would determine the shape of what came next. Nora did not know his name yet, not fully, not what it meant, but she slept for the first time in weeks without listening for footsteps in the hallway. That for now was enough. Tomorrow came gray and cold, the overnight snow having added another 2 inches to the streets. Nora was already awake when the knock came, measured professional, not urgent, not tentative. She had been awake since 5:30, sitting in one of the chairs by the window, while the girls slept, watching the parking lot and turning the shape of everything over in her mind. She looked through the peephole. Gideon stood in the hallway holding a paper bag and a cardboard drink carrier with 2 coffees and 2 small orange juices. He was looking directly at the peephole, which meant he knew approximately where it would be, which was the kind of small and specific knowledge that told you things about a person without them intending to tell you anything. Nora opened the door on the chain. "Mr. Morrow asked me to bring breakfast," Gideon said. He held up the bag, then held up a manila envelope thick with paper. "There's also this." "What is it?" "Information," he said, "and documentation. Mr. Morrow will explain everything when he arrives. He's coming here in about an hour." Nora looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she released the chain and opened the door. She took the bag, the drinks, the envelope. She did not invite him in. He did not appear to expect it. "One more thing," he said before she could close the door. He gestured toward a small panel mounted beside the door frame. She hadn't noticed it the night before, had been too focused on getting the girls settled. "This was installed this morning. If you press the lower button, someone is here in under 3 minutes. Anytime, any reason." Nora looked at the panel. Small, discreet, easily missed. He had that installed overnight. Yes. She did not know what to say to that. "Mr. Morrow takes care of problems thoroughly." Gideon said, not as flattery, but as simple description. "It's how he operates." He nodded once and walked down the corridor. Nora closed the door and stood for a moment with the manila envelope in both hands. The girls ate breakfast on the bed, croissants and fruit cups and orange juice, Callie with her legs crossed, Wren with her back against the headboard. Both initially cautious, then when the food turned out to be real and abundant and showing no signs of disappearing, gradually and gloriously relaxed in the way children allow themselves to be when they feel genuinely safe. Nora sat at the table with her coffee and opened the envelope. The first document made her read it twice because the first time the words would not settle into meaning. Debt cancellation and release. This document certifies that all debts attributed to Thomas Calloway, deceased, are hereby declared null and void. No further collection activity, lien enforcement, or property claim shall be pursued against Nora Calloway or her dependents by any party associated with Warren Pulsedale Inch or any affiliated entity. She turned the page. Bank records. Thomas's original loan agreement, the real one showing the principal of $8,000. Payment records showing that Thomas had paid $4,200 against that principal before he died. A certified accounting of all assets removed from the Callaway household between September and November valued at $94,000. A property assessment for the house on Sycamore Lane, $380,000. She sat with those numbers for a moment. Then she turned the last page. A single handwritten note in a precise and angular hand she did not recognize. You owed nothing. You were stolen from. This has been corrected. Nora set the pages down on the table. Mama, are you okay? Callie was watching her from the bed with her father's open, worried face. Yes, baby. You're crying again. I know. Nora pressed the back of her hand to her eyes. I'm okay. Eat your breakfast. Wren tore a piece of her croissant and held it out across the room. You should eat too, she said. You always forget. Nora crossed the room and took the piece of croissant from her daughter's hand. She ate it standing at the foot of the bed, and it tasted like butter and warmth, and the specific sweetness of something given without calculation, and she stood there with her 5-year-olds looking at her with their clear eyes, and felt the weight she had been carrying for 6 months shift very slightly from her alone. Declan Morrow knocked at 9:45. She had been expecting it, but her hands still tightened when the sound came. She looked through the peephole. He stood alone in the hallway, hands at his sides, in a charcoal gray suit that was precisely tailored and in every detail the opposite of the clothes she had been wearing for 3 weeks. She opened the door. Mrs. Callaway, he said, may I come in? She stepped aside. He entered and stopped just inside the door, the way a person stops when they are in a space that belongs to someone else and want to be clear that they understand the difference. He looked at Callie and Wren, who had turned from the television to study him with the unfiltered assessment of children who have learned that their first impressions of people are often more accurate than the adults around them would prefer. Good morning, he said to them. His voice, to Nora's surprise, was different than the night before, not softer exactly, but recalibrated, adjusted to the room and the people in it. Would you two like to watch something for a little while? Your mother and I need to talk. Callie looked at Nora. Nora nodded. The television went on. Callie settled in immediately. Wren kept her eyes on Declan for another 3 seconds, arriving at whatever conclusion she was going to arrive at before turning to the screen. Declan moved to the table and sat down. He folded his hands in front of him and looked at Nora directly. You read the documents? Yes. Then you understand that the debt is canceled. No balance, no conditions, no future claims against you or your daughters. I understand what the documents say. Nora sat down across from him. I don't understand why. Because the debt was fraudulent from the beginning. His voice was level precise. The original loan was $8,000. Thomas had paid back more than half of it before he died. The property documentation was forged. The $43,000 figure was invented whole cloth. He paused. You were targeted because you were a widow with no family nearby, no resources, no one to stand behind you. Pulse and Inch chose their victims specifically. Always widows, always mothers, always people who had no leverage and nowhere to take a complaint. Nora was quiet for a moment. How many others? She asked. 19 that we have confirmed so far. Likely more. He looked at her steadily. Restitution is being arranged. The collections are being reversed. The debts are being canceled. She looked at him across the small table. This man in his precise gray suit with his empire of things she didn't want to know about, and his folder of 19 families, and his single handwritten note you were stolen from. This has been corrected. They used your name, she said. Didn't they? When they collected. That's what you meant last night, whose name? It was yours. Something shifted in his eyes. Yes, he said. They told people their debts were sanctioned by you. They operated under the implication of my authority, used my name and my reputation to frighten people who had no way to verify it and were in no position to refuse. His voice was entirely controlled, but beneath the control there was something that was not quite anger, something colder and more fundamental, more personal. For at least a year, possibly longer. And you didn't know? No, because they chose victims who wouldn't know how to reach me, wouldn't know the right channels, wouldn't know that what they were being told had no authorization behind it. He paused. And because I didn't look closely enough at what was operating in my territory, the flat, unflinching self-assessment of it, no justification, no deflection. She had expected at least one of those things and got neither. What happened to Warren and Dale? She asked. They've been addressed. That's not a complete answer. No, he agreed, it's the one I can give you. She held his gaze. She thought about Dale Inch at the motel door at 2 in the morning. She thought about the bunk beds with the painted stars being carried down the stairs while her daughter stood in the doorway and watched. She thought about standing in her living room holding a document with a forged signature while Warren Pulse explained in his reasonable and patient voice that she had 48 hours. She found to her own surprise that she did not need the details. Are they going to come back? She asked. No, hey, you're certain? Yes, she believed him. Not because she was naive, she was the furthest thing from naive she had ever been, but because the certainty in his voice had the quality of a thing already accomplished rather than a thing being promised. There's an apartment, Declan said. When you're ready to leave the inn, 3rd floor Lincoln Square, good schools within walking distance. First 3 months covered. After that, it's yours to manage as you see fit. Nora opened her mouth. It's not charity, he said before she could speak. The apartment is restitution. What was taken from you? House, the furniture, Thomas's tools, 3 months of your daughter's stability has a value. The apartment is part of correcting an imbalance, not a gift, a correction. She looked at him. You use that word carefully, she said. Correction. It's the accurate word. Why does the accuracy matter to you? He was quiet for a moment. His hands were still folded on the table, and he looked at them briefly at the silver ring on his right hand before looking back at her. Because I know what it is to need something and have it framed as charity, he said, and I know what that framing does to people over time. It makes them smaller. It makes them feel they owe something they don't owe. His eyes met hers. You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Calloway. You never will. What's being done is being done because it should be done. That's all. Nora looked at this man who ran, whatever it was he ran, who made calls in the snow and had security panels installed overnight and spoke about violence and consequences with the calm of long habit. And she thought about the question that had been sitting in her chest since the night before. Why did you stop at my booth last night? She asked quietly. You could have sat down had your coffee left. You didn't know me. We were nothing to you. Declan was still for a long moment. When I was 8 years old, he said finally, my father was killed. Construction accident. A building collapse at a site with code violations that nobody had enforced because the developer paid the right people. He said this without apparent emotion, the way you describe something that was absorbed so long ago that the pain of it became structural rather than acute. My mother was left with me and my younger brother in a rental apartment in a job cleaning offices at night. He stopped, started again. Men came, similar men to Warren Pulse. My father had borrowed money less than Thomas borrowed, and through channels that weren't entirely unlike the ones Thomas used. They came to my mother and they told her what was owed and what would happen if it wasn't paid. She didn't have it. He paused. She did what she had to do to keep us housed and fed. Things she shouldn't have had to do. Things that cost her in ways I didn't understand until I was old enough to understand them. And by then the cost had already been fully paid. Nora was very still. There was a woman in our building, he continued. Her name was Agnes Holloway. She was in her 60s, lived alone, had nothing to spare. But every winter she left bread and soup outside our door when she knew my mother was working nights. Never knocked, never asked to be thanked, never once made my mother feel the weight of what she was doing. He looked at the table. When I went through the files on Pulse and Inch last night, I found her name, Agnes Holloway. They had taken everything she owned 2 years ago. Same method, same manufactured debt, same men. Nora closed her eyes briefly. I made a decision when I was very young, he said, about what I would do if I ever had the power to stop men like that. I have the power now. I stop them. He met her eyes steadily. That is the complete answer to your question. She believed this too. Not entirely, she understood that a man like Declan Morrow operated from multiple motivations simultaneously, that no one arrived at the kind of power he clearly possessed through simple virtue, but she believed the core of it. She believed Agnes Holloway. She believed the boy watching his mother. She believed that some things once decided become load-bearing walls in the architecture of a person's life and cannot be removed without the structure coming down. The apartment, she said after a moment. Where in Lincoln Square? He told her the address. He told her about the school 2 blocks east, the grocery store 3 blocks south, the small park around the corner, with a maple tree that was apparently something worth seeing in fall. He told her Gideon would help her move, that the apartment was furnished, that the refrigerator would be stocked. Then he reached into his jacket and placed a business card on the table between them. A single phone number. No name, no company, just 10 digits on a plain white card. If anyone threatens you again, he said, anyone, day or night. He stood. He walked to the door, and there he paused his hand on the frame and looked back at Callie and Wren. They had both turned from the television to watch him go. Wren perfectly serious with her measuring eyes, and her Thomas jaw looked at him for a moment and then said, "Thank you for breakfast." Declan Morrow looked at this 5-year-old child. Something moved through his face entirely unguarded, entirely at odds with the controlled precision of everything else about him, and it was there for only a second before it was gone, but Nora saw it, and she understood that she had seen something real. "You're welcome," he said quietly. Then he left. Nora sat at the table for a long time after the door closed, the business card in her hand, the manila envelope on the table, the morning light coming through the window in long, pale strips, the sound of her daughters talking softly to each other about the cartoon on the television, their voices unhurried, their bodies relaxed, the specific ease of children who have been allowed, at least for this moment, to simply be children. She held the plain white card with its single phone number. She held the folded $15 bill that was back in her pocket where it belonged. And she let herself, for the first time since June 14th, think about tomorrow without bracing for it. They moved into the apartment on Leland Avenue 4 days after Christmas. Nora carried her single duffel bag up 3 flights of stairs, while Gideon carried the paper bag from the inn, and Callie and Wren ran ahead of them both, their footsteps echoing in the stairwell, in a way that sounded to Nora like the specific sound of children who feel safe enough to make noise. She stopped in the doorway of the living room when she first saw it. It was not grand, it was not extravagant. It was a 2-bedroom apartment with clean walls and good light and furniture that was solid and simple and arranged as if by someone who had thought about how a family would actually move through a space. A couch deep enough to sleep on, a kitchen table with 4 chairs, bookshelves already holding a dozen children's books she would later discover were exactly the right reading level for 5-year-olds just beginning to tackle words independently. The girls' room had twin beds with navy blue frames, in a window seat with a cushion, and a toy chest that Callie opened with both hands and then stood staring into with an expression of absolute religious awe. Wren walked around the entire apartment, once methodically checking each room. Then she came back to where Nora was standing in the kitchen, still holding the duffel bag, and said simply, "This is ours." "Yes, baby." Wren nodded once with the air of someone filing important information correctly and went to investigate the toy chest. That first night after the girls were asleep in their new beds, Nora sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet. She could not bring herself to choose a room, yet couldn't make herself claim the space in that definitive way. So she sat on the floor and listened to the building settle around her, and to her daughters breathe through the open door, and she listened to the street below, a dog barking twice, a car passing someone's voice, distantly wishing someone else a Merry Christmas, and she felt the silence inside her change its quality, not the absence of sound, a different kind of presence within it. She was not listening for footsteps in the hallway. That was it. That was the whole of it. She was not calculating which direction to run, not mapping the exit in the dark. She was sitting on a kitchen floor in an apartment that was hers and listening to her daughter sleep. It was the most ordinary thing she had ever experienced. It felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. Spring came to Lincoln Square the way it always came to Chicago, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold nights that refused to surrender even as the days grew longer and the trees along Leland Avenue pushed out their first tentative green. Nora noticed all of it. She noticed it because, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, she had the capacity to notice things that were not threats. The maple tree around the corner from the apartment was the first thing she saw every morning from the kitchen window while the coffee brewed. She watched it the way you watch something you have been told is valuable but are still in the process of learning to trust. By March, it had small buds. By April, it had leaves. By May, it was fully opened, and on the morning she stood at the window and understood that she had watched an entire tree come back to life. Without once being afraid of what was outside, she put her coffee down and cried for about 3 minutes, and then poured herself a fresh cup and got the girls ready for school. This was what healing looked like. She was learning it slowly with the particular humility of someone who had no precedent for it. Not a single moment of revelation. Not a morning you woke up and found the weight was gone. It was a maple tree. It was coffee getting cold while you watched something ordinary. It was your daughters leaving for school with backpacks that were full because you had filled them the night before without calculating what you could and couldn't afford to include. It was the slow and undramatic accumulation of mornings that did not require you to survive them. Gideon came on the second Tuesday of every month. Never the first, never the third, the second regular, as a calendar reliable as weather. He knocked at precisely 10 in the morning when the girls were at school and Nora was home before her afternoon shift. He brought a grocery store gift card and a folded receipt showing a utility payment made in advance, and he delivered them with the unhurried professionalism of a man executing instructions he had been given and saw no reason to question. Nora had tried to refuse the first time. "I'm working now," she said. "I have income." Gideon looked at her with the steady patience of a man who had anticipated this. "Mr. Morrow is aware. He asks that you accept these for the time being." "For how long?" "Until you don't need them." "How will you know when that is?" "We'll know," he said, and he had been, it turned out, entirely correct. Gable's Florals was on Lincoln Avenue, 6 blocks from the apartment, a narrow shop with a green awning and buckets of cut flowers arranged on a tiered stand outside the door, and an interior that smelled permanently and deeply of roses and cold water and greenery. The owner, Margaret Gable Marge, she insisted, was a woman in her late 60s with arthritic hands and a comprehensive knowledge of every flower that had ever grown anywhere, and the habit of evaluating new employees by watching how they handled the flowers before she watched anything else. On Nora's first morning, Marge put a bucket of tulips in front of her without explanation and watched. Nora trimmed the stems at an angle, removed the lower leaves, checked for damage, and arranged them by height without being asked. She had done this without thinking, the way you do things that come from somewhere deeper than conscious knowledge. Her grandmother had kept a garden, had shown her these things, the way she'd shown her how to make pie crust, with the assumption that things worth knowing were worth teaching properly. Marge watched all of this and then said, "You can start Thursday." By February, Nora was opening the shop 3 mornings a week. By March, she was managing the ordering. By May, when Marge's arthritis made the early mornings difficult, Nora was there first, unlocking the door and putting the buckets out before Marge arrived, and the shop ran better for it in ways that neither of them discussed directly, but both understood entirely. She was good at this work. She had expected to be competent, serviceable, but she found that she was genuinely good at it in the specific way that means the work asks something of you that you actually have to give. The arrangements required attention to how things related to each other, how color and form and scale created something greater than the sum of the parts. It required the kind of patient and iterative care that could not be rushed without being ruined. She thought sometimes that the last year had been preparation for this in the grim and unasked for way that certain experiences are preparation for certain things. The girls loved the shop. On Saturdays when school was out and Marge didn't mind, Nora brought them in, and they sat on the stool behind the counter and handed her things when she asked, and ate the cookies Marge produced from somewhere in the back room, and talked to customers with the unself-conscious friendliness of children who had recently rediscovered that strangers were not automatically dangerous. Callie talked to everyone. She had Thomas's open face and his instinct for warmth and his inability to enter a room without wanting to understand the people in it. She made friends at school with the easy and genuine sociability of someone to whom friendship is simply what you do with people when you find yourself in the same place as them. Wren was more deliberate. She watched first evaluated, arrived at decisions about people that she kept until she was fully certain. Her teacher, a young woman named Miss Amy, with patient eyes and excellent instincts about children, called Nora in February to say that Wren was one of the most perceptive students she had ever taught and that she wanted to discuss a possible placement in the district's gifted program. Nora sat in the small chair across from Miss Amy's desk, the kind of chair designed for children that every parent sat in slightly awkwardly and listened to this woman describe her daughter with such specific and accurate affection that she had to press her lips together to keep her composure. She drove home and called Thomas's voicemail. She did this occasionally. His number had been disconnected and reassigned months ago. The voicemail long since cleared, but she still dialed it sometimes when something happened that he should have known about. She let it ring. She listened to the automated message, and then she talked into it anyway briefly, and then she hung up and got on with the day. This time she said Wren's being tested for the gifted program. You would have made an insufferable big deal about this, and I would have pretended to be annoyed at you for it, and I miss you so much that I can't sometimes, Thomas. But we're okay. I need you to know that. We're okay. She hung up. She drove to pick up the girls from school. She was getting there. The second year was different from the first in ways she had not anticipated. The first year had been about survival, learning to breathe again, learning to sleep, learning to trust that the locked door would stay locked and the next morning would come. Learning to rebuild the basic architecture of a functional life brick by painstaking brick in the space that catastrophe had cleared. The second year was about something quieter and in its own way harder. It was about figuring out who she was now. She enrolled in a business management course at the community college 2 evenings a week. Marge had been suggesting it for months with the combination of directness intact that characterized everything Marge did. "You're running this shop more than I am," she said one October morning, without looking up from her order book. "You should understand the numbers properly." The course met Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Nora arranged a babysitter, a woman named Dot from the 3rd floor, who was 72 and had been widowed 15 years ago, and approached the girls with the same practical affection she brought to everything, feeding them dinner and playing cards with them and asking for their opinions on television programs with apparent seriousness. She was not just learning the business management course, she was learning what she was capable of when she was not afraid. And the answer, it turned out, was considerably more than she had known. On a Thursday morning in March, 2 years and 3 months after Christmas Eve, At the diner, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and a notepad covered in numbers. She had been awake since 5. The girls were still asleep. Outside, the maple tree was just beginning its second spring since she had arrived, and she watched it while she waited for Gideon to answer. He picked up on the second ring as always. "Mrs. Calloway, I need to tell you something," she said. "All right, I paid rent this month on my own, my full rent from my paycheck." She looked at the numbers on the notepad. "I've run the figures for the next 6 months, and I can cover everything: rent, utilities, groceries, the girls' school expenses without the gift cards. Marge is increasing my hours in April, and there's a conversation about a formal management role, which would mean a salary adjustment." She paused. "I don't need the support anymore. I want to stop accepting it." Silence on the other end. Not uncomfortable, Gideon's silences never were. The silence of a man absorbing information and deciding what to do with it. "I'll let Mr. Morrow know," he said finally. "How do you think he'll respond?" A brief pause. "Honestly, I think he'll be glad to hear it." Nora looked at her notepad, at the numbers that finally cleanly added up. "Gideon," she said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "The support, the gift cards, the utilities. Was that always his instruction? All of it for all this time?" The pause this time was longer than any previous pause in any conversation she had ever had with Gideon. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm not upset," she said. "I'm just asking." He was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Morrow gave the instruction to provide support for a period of 3 months," Gideon said carefully. "At the end of 3 months, he reviewed your situation and determined that you had the capacity and the foundation to manage independently. He said, and I'm quoting him accurately, that continuing beyond that point would be an insult to your intelligence and your competence." Nora was very still. "The months after that," she said slowly, "the 14 months of gift cards, the utilities, those were my decision," Gideon said. "My own funds, my own judgment." Silence. "For 14 months," she said. "Approximately." Nora sat with this. She thought about the second Tuesday of every month for 14 months. About Gideon at her door, the same knock, the same unhurried professionalism, and somewhere underneath it, entirely invisible, entirely unannounced, in an act of sustained and personal generosity that had nothing to do with instructions and everything to do with the private decision of one human being to take care of another without credit, without acknowledgement, without any expectation of being found out. She was crying before she knew she was going to. Not grief crying or fear crying. The kind that happens when you understand suddenly and completely that you have been cared for by people who expected nothing from the caring. The kind that comes from gratitude so large it has nowhere to go but out. "Gideon," she said when she could speak clearly. "Mrs. Calloway, thank you." A pause, shorter than the others. "You would have gotten there on your own," he said quietly. "You were always going to get there on your own. I just shortened the distance a little." Nora pressed the back of her hand to her eyes. "Tell Mr. Morrow I said thank you as well," she said, "for the 3 months and for knowing when to stop." "I will," Gideon said. "He'll appreciate that." She hung up. She finished her coffee. She got her daughters ready for school. She was fine. She was, for the first time in 2 years and 3 months, exactly and entirely herself. Not a widow enduring, not a mother surviving. Herself whole, upright, standing on ground she had built with her own hands. That felt like something worth noting. She noted it, and then she got on with the day. The 5th Christmas Eve arrived the way the first one had, with snow. Chicago in December was reliably itself, and Nora had come to love this about it in the years since Lincoln Square had become home, really home, the kind that lives in the body rather than just the address book. The snow on Leland Avenue fell through the glow of the street lights and thick, soft curtains, and the storefronts had their Christmas lights strung, and the smell of the city in winter cold air, and somewhere a wood fire, and the particular clean mineral scent of snow itself was by now so deeply associated with safety and ordinary life that she breathed it in deliberately. Callie and Ren were 10 years old. This was still a fact that required occasional recalibration. She would look at them and feel the dissonance between the 5-year-old she carried in memory, pressed against her sides in a corner booth, wearing thin beige sweaters, learning not to ask for things, and these two actual human beings currently walking beside her down Leland Avenue, deep in an argument about hot chocolate toppings that had been running with brief intermissions for approximately 6 blocks. Marshmallows dissolve, Callie was saying, with the authority of someone presenting research. That's the point. They melt into the chocolate and make it creamier. Whipped cream also melts, Ren countered, precise and unimpressed as always. And it tastes better while it's melting. There are different kinds of melting. That is not a thing. It absolutely is a thing. Nora walked between them with her hands in her coat pockets and felt something so large and so quiet moving through her that she didn't try to name it. She had learned in 5 years not to try to name everything. Some things were larger than any name you could give them. They had been making this walk every Christmas Eve for 4 years. The diner on South Halsted was gone. It had closed a year after that night. The building sold and renovated into a glass-fronted coffee shop that sold pour-over coffee and had exposed brick and a chalkboard menu. Nora had felt the loss of the original building with a specificity that surprised her, as if the place itself deserved to remain unchanged as a marker of the night that split her life into before and after. But the coffee shop was warm and the hot chocolate was excellent, and the booth in the corner, approximately where the old corner booth had been, on the same piece of floor under the same geometry of the room, was where they always sat. Ritual mattered. She had learned this in the years since. The small repeated ceremonies of a life were how you told yourself what the life meant, how you remembered the path you had walked, how you honored the distance between where you had been and where you were. The coffee shop was warm when they pushed through the door, Christmas music playing softly, the smell of coffee and warm pastry and pine from a wreath on the door. Callie went immediately to study the menu board. Ren stood at Nora's side and surveyed the room with the attentive, cataloging gaze she had been born with and had refined in 10 years into something genuinely formidable. "I like this place," Ren said. "I know. Even though the old place is gone." Even though, Ren considered, the old place was important. Yes. Is that why we come here, because of what happened at the old place? Nora looked at her younger daughter, 10 years old, serious-faced, already more observant than most adults Nora knew, and thought about how to answer honestly. "Partly," she said, "and partly because good hot chocolate on Christmas Eve is important in itself." Ren accepted this with the small nod she gave things that she found philosophically adequate. They settled into the corner booth. Callie ordered for all 3 of them with the confidence of someone who had been making decisions since they walked in. The hot chocolates arrived topped with both marshmallows and whipped cream, which the young barista had apparently decided was the correct diplomatic resolution, and which caused Callie to look at Nora with the expression of someone vindicated by events beyond her control. Nora wrapped both hands around her cup. She was here. She was warm. Her daughters were 10 years old and arguing about toppings and completely ordinarily wonderfully fine. She noticed on the small wooden rack near the window a copy of a business journal we hadn't seen before. Chicago Commerce, the masthead read. Winter issue. The cover story headline was visible from where she sat. Morrow Capital, the quiet force rebuilding Chicago's South Side. She reached over and picked it up. The article was 4 pages. She read the first 2. Declan Morrow, a private and rarely photographed figure, had in the past 5 years directed several $100 million of investment into underserved neighborhoods on Chicago's South and West Sides, focusing on affordable housing, small business infrastructure, and community development. One unnamed source described him as having an absolute and non-negotiable intolerance for predatory practices of any kind within his business environment. The article noted his reluctance to speak to the press, his reputation for unusual directness in business dealings, and the fact that several community organizations operating in areas of his investment had described him as unexpectedly a reliable and long-term supporter. The photograph was small and slightly grainy, taken from a distance the way his photographs always were. A man in a dark overcoat getting into a car, his face half turned, his expression unreadable. Silver at the temples now, 5 years older. She looked at the photograph for a moment, then she turned the page. She almost turned past it. It was a small item, a quarter page in the section near the back that covered philanthropic announcements and foundation news. The heading read, Morrow Capital announces expansion of the Thomas Callaway Memorial Scholarship. Nora's hands went still on the page. She read it once. Then she read it again slowly because the words required reading twice to be fully received. The Thomas Callaway Memorial Scholarship, administered through Morrow Capital's Community Foundation, had been established 3 years ago to provide educational support for children of widowed or single parents facing financial hardship in the Chicago metropolitan area. In its first 3 years, the scholarship had supported 47 students. The announcement detailed an expansion, new funding, an increased number of annual recipients, a partnership with 3 additional school districts. The scholarship bore the name of Thomas Callaway, a 34-year-old electrician from Oak Park with a crooked rope swing and a dream about a company and a heart condition he had kept to himself because he hadn't wanted anyone to worry. A man who had made a mistake and paid for it in the final currency, and whose name had been heading in the ordinary way of such things toward being remembered only in the records of the people who had loved him. Declan Morrow had taken that name, the name of a man he had never met, knew only through a woman's grief and a folder of documents, and the forged signature on a piece of paper, and attached it to something that would outlast all of them. He had decided in whatever deliberate and precise way he made his decisions, that Thomas Callaway's name would not mean failure. It would not mean debt. It would mean opportunity. It would mean the children of people like Thomas, people who tried and ran out of time, who loved their families more than they understood their own limitations, who made mistakes they could not correct, would have something they would not otherwise have had. He had given Thomas back his dignity. He had done it without telling her. He had done it 3 years ago, and she was reading about it now on Christmas Eve in a corner booth, and the hot chocolate was getting cold, and her daughters were watching her with the particular expression children wear when they know something important is happening to their mother, but are not yet sure whether to be worried. Mama, Callie's voice soft the way it got when she was being careful. Are you okay? Nora looked up, both girls watching her, Callie with her father's open, worried face, Wren with those steady, measuring eyes. Yes, Nora said, I'm very okay. You're crying, Wren observed. I know. Is it the sad kind or the other kind? Nora thought about this, about what kind of crying it was, about whether there was a name for the particular sensation of having something restored to you that you had not known could be restored, had not thought to ask for, had quietly and privately grieved as one of the permanent losses. The other kind, she said, the good kind. Wren nodded, satisfied. Callie reached across the table and pushed Nora's hot chocolate closer to her. Drink it before it gets cold, she said in the tone she had taken directly from Thomas, the one that meant, this is what I can do for you, and I am doing it because I love you without needing to say any of that. Nora drank her hot chocolate. She folded the magazine and put it in her coat pocket. She would keep it. It would go into the box in her closet where she kept the things that mattered. The letter from the toolbox, the wedding ring, the worn $15 bill that was still in her wallet, still folded along its original creases, still carried every day, not as a relic of grief, but as the specific and particular shape of one night that had changed the course of everything. The night a door opened and a dangerous man sat down across from her and listened. She had never called the number on the plain white card. It was in the box too beside Thomas's letter, and she had looked at it many times over 5 years without calling it. She had turned the question over occasionally whether to reach out to say something beyond the silent arithmetic of a life rebuilt, and she had never arrived at a reason that felt adequate to the weight of what had been given. She had come to understand that this was perhaps the point, that what he had done was not structured to receive acknowledgement, had been given specifically and deliberately without any expectation of return. He had told her she owed him nothing. She believed him. But she thought about him sometimes, not often, not in a way that demanded anything. Simply in the background of ordinary moments, putting flowers in a vase, watching the maple tree come back to life for the 5th time, hearing her daughters argue with complete confidence about the relative merits of hot chocolate toppings, which was the kind of argument only possible for children who have never had to worry about whether there would be hot chocolate. The way you think about the people who change the path you're walking, even when they are nowhere near where you are now. Outside the coffee shop window, the snow was falling on South Halsted Street. The Christmas lights on the storefronts blurred through it soft and bright, the way lights look through the particular kind of snow that falls straight down in large, slow flakes, unhurried, covering everything equally. "Can we get another one?" Callie asked, holding up her empty cup. "Yes," Nora said. "We can." Across the city on the 38th floor of a building on Wacker Drive, Gideon set a single sheet of paper on the desk. Declan Morrow looked up from what he was reading. "Annual report," Gideon said. "Callaway family." Declan set down his pen. He read the sheet the way he read everything completely, without rushing with the full allocation of his attention. Nora Callaway, 36 years old, managing partner Gable's Florals. The partnership made official in September. Income stable and growing, no outstanding debts, no security concerns of any kind. Apartment lease renewed through the following year. Callaway daughters age 10, both enrolled in Lincoln Square Elementary Gifted Program. Academic performance in the top percentile for their grade cohort. One teacher notation which Gideon had included verbatim because he knew Declan would want the precision. Callie Callaway has her father's warmth. A second notation from the same file, Ren Callaway will run something someday. Declan read that last line twice. He set the paper down on the desk. Outside his window, Chicago spread itself in every direction under falling snow. Its grid of streets illuminated from below the lake, a dark edge at the far horizon, the snow erasing the distance between things, making the city look for a few hours each year, only in weather like this, like something simpler and kinder than it actually was. He had lived in this city for most of his adult life. He still noticed this when it happened. "She went to the coffee shop tonight," Gideon said. "With the girls, the one on Halsted." "I know." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Then she found the article about the scholarship." Declan was still. "Marge Gable's daughter works at the Journal," Gideon said. "She mentioned it to Marge. Marge put a copy in the rack this afternoon." A pause. "I thought you should know." Declan looked at the city. He thought about a woman in a worn olive jacket sitting in a corner booth counting $15. He thought about 2 small girls with their father's blonde hair eating grilled cheese sandwiches with both hands. He thought about a fold in a $15 bill that he had registered in the moment as the bill of a woman in desperate circumstances, not understanding until months later when Gideon had told him what Nora had told him about the bill, about the ATM record, about the last $20 Thomas Callaway had ever withdrawn from a machine on Harrison Street, that he had handed back something irreplaceable without knowing what it was. He thought about his mother, who had died at 53, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who had never had enough help at the right time, who had been worn down slowly and incrementally by the specific kind of hardship that has no dramatic moment, only the accumulated weight of years of not quite enough. He thought about Agnes Holloway, who was alive and housed and had been relocated to a warm apartment in Hyde Park with a garden view where she grew tomatoes in the summer and received an anonymous monthly deposit that she had, according to Gideon's reports, decided not to question. He thought about the 47 students who had gone to school on a scholarship bearing the name of a man they had never known, A man who had worked with his hands and loved his family and borrowed money he shouldn't have and died too young and deserved at the very minimum to have his name attached to something that helped people forward rather than held them back. He thought about Warren Pulse and Dale Lynch, who were alive and who had spent the past 5 years making restitution to 19 families under terms that left them no alternative, and who understood now with a clarity that had been delivered in the most direct possible way what happened when you operated in Declan Morrow's territory, using Declan Morrow's name for purposes Declan Morrow had not sanctioned. He thought about a boy sitting in a cold hallway outside a locked apartment while his mother worked nights counting the minutes until she came home swearing to himself that when he had power, he would use it for something other than fear. He was not a good man. He had never claimed to be and would not begin now. The world he operated in had costs that he paid and costs that others paid, and he held no illusions about the accounting. The ledger of his life would never fully balance. He had accepted this a long time ago in the way you accept certain structural facts about the ground you have chosen to stand on. But 5 years ago on Christmas Eve, a woman had sat in a corner booth with $15 and 2 hungry daughters and no plan beyond the next hour. And he had sat down across from her, and he had listened, and he had done what was within his power to do. "Close the file," Declan said. Gideon reached for the single sheet of paper on the desk. Declan put his hand on it first. He held it for a moment, the clean columns, all indicators, positive the teacher's notation about Ren Calloway, written in careful schoolroom handwriting, and then he left it where it was. "Tomorrow," he said. Gideon understood. He always did. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Declan stood at the window alone. The snow was falling on everything on the streets below, and the buildings across the river. In the neighborhood on the south side, where a woman was sitting with her daughters in a warm coffee shop, drinking hot chocolate, not looking at the door, not listening for footsteps, not counting what she had left and calculating whether it would be enough. Just sitting with her children on Christmas Eve, planning nothing more than whether to order a second round. On the south side of the city, in a corner booth, the family was whole. Not because the world had become kinder, not because the men who preyed on the vulnerable had stopped existing, not because grief had been undone, or the house on Sycamore Lane had been returned, or Thomas Calloway had been given back the time that was taken from him. But because on one night 5 years ago, a door opened and a dangerous man made a choice, and the choice was this: not to look away. That was all it had been. That was the whole of it. And in the morning, the family on Leland Avenue would wake up, and Nora would make coffee and watch the maple tree through the kitchen window and get her daughters ready for whatever the day held. And they would move through it without fear, and they would make plans for next week and next month and next year, and all of that, the entire and spectacular and precious machinery of an ordinary life freely lived, existed because of a single choice made in a diner on South Halsted Street on the worst night of a woman's life. Declan Morrow stood at the window and looked at the city he had spent his life navigating. He left the file on the desk. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the old streets and the old scars, the places where things had been taken, and the places where things had been restored, the distance between a penthouse window and a corner booth, between a man who lived in the dark and a family that had learned finally and completely to live in the light. It covered everything. And in the morning, Chicago would wake to find itself clean,